In this tutorial, I'm going to use the Vogel's approximation method to find the initial basic feasible solution of the transportation problem that has 4 destinations A, B, C, D, and 3 sources F1, F2, and F3. So given that problem, to find the initial basic feasible solution using the Vogel's approximation method, we have to calculate the penalties for the rows and then go on and calculate the penalties for the columns. I'll start by looking at calculating penalties for the rows there. And to calculate the penalty for row number 1, we look for the least cost in that row, and we have a 4 there. Then we look for the next least cost, and the next least cost there is a 17. And then we take the difference of those two that I've highlighted. The difference between 17 and 4 is a 13, so that's the penalty for row number 1. We now go on to row number 2. We look for the least cost, it's a 7, and the next least cost is a 9. Then take the difference of those highlighted costs, and it gives us a 2. So that's the penalty for row number 2. Move on to row number 3. And the least cost is a 15, and the next least cost is a 20. Take the difference of those highlighted 2, we see it's a 5, so that's the penalty for row number 3. We are now done for the rows. We now move on to the columns. For the columns, that is destination A, and the least cost there is a 20, and the next least cost is a 24. And the difference of those two is a 4. We are done with A. We move on to column B, the second one there. And the least cost is a 22. The next least cost is a 37. And the difference is a 15. So that's the penalty there for the second column. Move on to the third column where we have destination C there. And the least cost is a 9. And the next least cost is a 17. Take the difference, and that's an 8. So the penalty for column C there is an 8. We now move on to column D. Look for the least cost in that column, it's a 4. The next least cost is a 7. Take the difference, we see that the difference there is a 3. So now that we have the penalties for the rows and the columns, we now look at the row or column with the largest penalty. The largest penalty that we see is a 15 there. So what we have to do is, for the row or the column that has the largest penalty, we look at the least cost in that row or column, then allocate as much as possible. In this case, we are saying that column B is the largest penalty. So we go to column B and look at the least cost is at 22. So we have to allocate in this cell. So we have to allocate as much as possible in this cell so that we satisfy the supply and demand constraints. On those constraints, we have a 120 there for the supply and 40 for the demand. To see how much we can allocate, we take the minimum of the 40 and the 120, and that minimum is a 40. So we have to allocate 40 units in that cell that I have highlighted in green there. So we go on and allocate 40 units there. But the moment we allocate the 40 units, that means we have already satisfied the demand for destination B, which will mean that we can no longer allocate anything in that column. Because if we allocate, they need to exceed the demand that is required for that destination. So to indicate we are no longer allocating in that column, since the demand has been met, we'll cross out here and cross out here. And the moment we cross out for that column, that means we will not be calculating penalties for that column. And for the cells that I have crossed out, we will no longer lose the costs when you are calculating the penalties. So I'll cross out here and there and here and here, indicating that we will not calculate penalties for this particular column. So we now go on to calculate the penalties again for the rows and for the columns, but excluding the costs that are in the crossed out cells. So starting with row number 1, the list cost there is a 4, and the next list cost is a 17. The difference is a 13, which is our penalty for row number 1. We now move on to row number 2, and the list cost is a 7, and the next list cost is a 9, and the difference is a 2, so that's the penalty for row number 2. Move on to row number 3, and the list cost is a 15, and the next list cost is a 20. The difference is a 5, so that's the penalty for row number 3. We are done with the rows. We then move on to the columns. The column where we have destination A, and the list cost is a 20, and the next list cost is a 24. And then the difference is a 4, so that's the penalty for that column. For column B, we said we are no longer calculating the penalties, so I'll move on to column C there. For column C, the list cost is a 9, and the next list cost is a 17. And the difference is an 8, so we put an 8 for the penalty there. Move on to column D. The list cost there in that column is a 4. The next list cost is a 7. Take the difference of 7 and 4. We see that the difference is a 3. So we are now done for the penalties for the row and the columns. So we now look for the row or column with the largest penalty. We see that the one with the largest penalty there is the one with the 13 there. So it's row number 1. So we look at row number 1 and look at the list cost in that row. The list cost is a 4, so we have to allocate in this cell. And to look at how much we can allocate, we consider the supply constraint, the 120. But the 120, we have to take note that we have already allocated a 40 there. So it will be, we'll be looking at 120 minus the 40 there, which gives us an 80. And then for the demand constraint, we are having a 110. So what we should be considering there is the minimum of 80 and 110. And that minimum is an 80. So that means we can allocate 80 units there. So we allocate 80 in that cell. But the moment we allocate the 80 in that cell, that means we have now reached the supply capacity for source F1. And if that has occurred, that means we can no longer allocate in row number 1. So to indicate we can no longer allocate in row number 1, we have to cross out all the cells where there are possible allocations to indicate we cannot allocate there. So we can not allocate here and we cannot allocate here because we have already reached the supply constraint, the 120. And the moment we do that, we'll also cross out for the penalties to indicate we will not be calculating the penalties for that row. So I'll cross out here and cross out here and cross out here, indicating that we will no longer calculate penalties for that row. So when we are done, we now move on to calculating the penalties again for the rows and the columns. And now we are starting at row number 2, since for row number 1, we are no longer calculating penalties. For row number 2, the list cost there is a 7. The next list cost is a 9. The difference is a 2, so the penalty there, we write a 2. Move on to the third row, and the list cost is a 15, and the next list cost is a 20. And the difference is a 5. And we are done with the rows. We now move on to the columns. We are now looking at the column where we have a destination A there. The list cost we are having 24, where there's no allocation or where there is no X. So we have a 24 as the list cost. We are not considering the 20 because we have crossed out that cell. So we have the list cost there for that column is a 24. The next list cost is a 32. The difference, it gives us an 8. So that's the penalty for the column A. Move on to the next one. We are now looking at column C, because for B, we are no longer calculating penalties. For the column where we have the C, the least cost is a 9, the next least cost is a 20. And the difference, it will give us an 11. So that's the penalty for column C there. We now move on to the next one, where we have the D there, the column D. The least cost in that column is a 7. The next least cost is a 15. We take the difference is an 8. So we write that penalty there is the 8. So we have calculated the penalties. We now look for the largest penalty for the row or column. So the largest penalty that we are having now in this case is the 11 there. And the 11 is corresponding to column C. So what we do is we go to column C, then look for the least cost in that column, and that least cost there is a 9. So we have to allocate in this cell where we have that least cost. And to see how much we can allocate, we have to look at the supply constraint, it's a 70. The demand constraint is a 30. So we would have to allocate the minimum of 70 and 30, and that minimum is a 30. So we allocate 30 units in that cell. But when we have allocated that 30 there, that means we have already reached the demand for column C there. So we can no longer allocate anymore in column C. So I'll cross out this part here, indicating that we can no longer allocate anything there, because we have already met the demand of 30 there. So when we can no longer allocate, we cross out again for the penalties, indicating that we'll be no longer calculating the penalties. So I'll cross out here and I'll cross out here, indicating that we are no longer calculating penalties there. So we now move on to calculating the penalties again, starting with the rows and the columns. So in this case, we are now moving to row number 2, because for row number 1, we are not calculating penalties. So for row number 2, the least cost is a 7, and the next least cost is a 24. And the difference is 17, so that's the penalty for that row. I now move on to the third row, the F3 there. The least cost is a 15, and the next least cost is a 32. The difference is a 17, so we put a 17 there for the penalty. We are done for the rows. We move on to the columns. For the columns, the column where we have the A there, the least cost is a 24. When we are looking at that column A, the next least cost is a 32. And the difference there is an 8, so we have to put the 8 there for the penalty. For column B, we are not calculating penalties. For column C, we are not calculating penalties. We calculate the penalty for column D. The least cost is a 7. The next least cost is a 15. And the difference is an 8, so we put the 8 there. So now that we have found penalties, we look at largest penalty. But in this case, we have a tie there. We have two 17s. And if you have a tie, you first look at the one which is on the lower numbered row. So we have row number 2 and row number 3. They are each having 17. So we have to allocate to row number 2 first, the lower numbered row. So we'll be looking at the penalty there of 17, since we have the tie and we have the 17 on row number 2. So in row number 2 there, we look at the least cost is a 7. So we have to allocate as much as possible in this cell. To see how much we can allocate, we look at the supply constraint, it's a 7. But for the 70, we have to take note that we have already allocated a 30 there. So if we have already allocated the 30, we'll be looking at 70 minus 30, which gives us a 40. So when looking at the supply constraint, we are looking at 40. And when looking at the demand constraint, we are looking at 110 minus 80, because we have already allocated an 80 in that column. So for the 80 there, it will give us a 30. So look at the minimum of the 30 and the 40. So that the minimum there is a 30. So we can allocate 30 units there. So we put 30 units in that cell. And the moment we put the 30 units there, we can no longer allocate any more in that column, because what it is saying is we have already reached demand for column D, which is 110. So I'll cross out here to indicate that we can no longer allocate since the demand has already been met. And when I cross out there, that means we can no longer calculate the penalties for that column. So I'll cross out here again, indicate we will not calculate the penalty there. So we are done there. We now move on to calculating the penalties. So for row number 2, we are looking at the least cost is a 24. So that's the only one that we have there. So that will be our penalty. And for row number 3 there, we are having a 32. And that's the only cost that we now have. So that will be our penalty, a 32. When you are looking at now the column A, we are having a 24 as the least cost. The next least cost is a 32. Then the difference is an 8. Then we look at the largest penalty. The largest penalty that we are having there is a 32 there in row number 3, where we have the F3. So in F3, we are looking at this cell. And that's where we can allocate and see how much we can allocate there. We look at the supply constraint, it's a 50, and the demand constraints, it's a 60. So we look at the minimum of the 50 and the 60. So we have to allocate 50 units in that cell. So I'll go on and allocate 50 units. And when we allocate the 50 units, that means for row number 3 there, we are done. What we now have to look at is the only cell that is left that has no allocation is this cell here. And to see how much we can allocate there, we look at the supply constraint, it's 70. But in that row, we've already allocated 30, 30 there. So we are looking at 70 minus 30 minus 30, which gives us a 10. And for the demand constraint, we have a 60, but we've already allocated a 50 there. So to see how much you can allocate, it would be the 60 minus 50, which is a 10. So in this case, we see that we can allocate 10 units in that cell. So I'll go on and allocate 10 units. So in this case, we have made all the allocations, and then we just have to check if all the things are balancing there before we interpret that table. So we look at the first row, it has allocations of 40 and 80, which will add up to the 120. The second row, we have 10 plus 30 plus 30, which adds up to the 70. The third row, we have the 50, which satisfies the supply there of 50. For column A, we are having allocations of 10 and 50, which add up to 60. For column B, we're having a 40, which satisfies the demand of 40 there. For column C, we have an allocation of 30, which satisfies the demand of 30 there. For column D, we are having allocations of 80 and 30, which add up to 110, which satisfy the demand there of 110. So in this case, our things are balancing. We go on and interpret what is in the table there. So we have the destination and the allocation and the cost. What we are saying is from source F1 to destination B, we are allocating 40 units. 40 units at a unit cost of 22. So the cost will be 40 times 22, which gives us 880. The next one, we are looking at from F1 to D. We are allocating 80 units. 80 units at a unit cost of 4. Of the cost will be 80 times 4, which gives us 320. The next one, we are looking at source F2 to destination A. We are allocating 10 units. 10 units at a unit cost of 24. The cost will be 10 times 24, which gives us 240. For the next one, we are looking at from F2 to C. F2 to C, we are allocating 30 units. 30 units at a unit cost of 9. and the cost will be 30 times 9, which gives us 270. For the next one, we are having from F2 to D, we are allocating 30 units. 30 units at a unit cost of 7, and the cost will be 30 times 7, which gives us 210. Then for the last one, we are having from F3 to A, we are allocating 50 units. 50 units at a unit cost of 32, and the cost there will be 50 times 32, which gives us 1,600. I'll go on and sum those so that we get the total cost, and that total cost 880 plus 320 plus 240 plus 270 plus 210 plus 1,600, it gives us 3,520. So we are having there the initial basic feasible solution using the Vogel's approximation method is giving us a cost of 3,520.